Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Diener, and I'm the Executive Director of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. Welcome to our webinar today, which will focus on the realities of self-reliance within the Ugandan refugee context. Over the next hour, we will hear from experts at ULearn and REACH on their newest research, which aims at understanding how the livelihoods of refugees and host community households in Uganda can best be supported in the context of persistent vulnerabilities and reduced funding. Through the research, evidence, and data pillar at the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, we aim to strengthen and promote innovations in humanitarian response through the dissemination of innovative new research like this to inform programming and policy. This particular study goes into depth on the primary barriers to sustainable livelihoods for refugees and host communities in Uganda, and also delves into the contextual differences in urban areas and settlements. So without further ado, let's get started on this informative session. I'm excited to introduce you to Marika Delu. Marika works at the Response Innovation Lab, a global initiative of multiple NGOs which promotes improved outcomes for refugees and host communities and focuses on facilitating learning, conducting assessments, and amplifying refugee voice and choice. Response Innovation Lab is the consortium lead for the Uganda Learning, Evidence, Accountability, and Research Network, or ULearn for short. She is based in Kampala, Uganda, and has led the Learning Hub component of ULearn from the consortium's inception 3.5 years ago. ULearn is undertaking really interesting work, and we're so excited to hear about it today. So over to you, Marika.
Thanks a lot, Carrie, for that very kind introduction. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words about ULearn, obviously without repeating what you have said, Carrie. Thank you very much. So ULearn is a consortium led by a consortium of 3 organizations led by Response Innovation Lab, as Carrie highlighted. So the 3 organizations are Response Innovation Lab itself. We lead the learning component, cross-sectoral learning for the refugee response, impact initiatives, who lead the research component, and the next person speaking will be my research colleague Melle, who will talk a little bit about the work impact initiatives and REACH does on research in the Uganda refugee response. And then the third partner is IRC, who focuses on accountability to affected populations. So the whole of ULearn is really it's an innovation in itself. It's about changing the aid system to improve evidence and insights, the use of evidence and insights and refugee voices and choices in a humanitarian or refugee response. And so we really believe that refugee response is most impactful when it maximizes the use of evidence and integrates those voices and preferences from refugees. I think the only really important thing to flag is that we act as a public good. So we really support refugee response actors across all of the stakeholder groups, including local and refugee-led organizations, as well as private sector actors and the more classic UN, INGOs, government, to improve their programming and to make use of learning, evidence, and insights. Now, at the moment, we're focusing a lot on sustainable livelihoods. And of course, that's what we're talking about today is our research on self-reliance that was led by Melle, who will be talking in a minute. And then we're also focusing on climate and energy at the moment with a lot of interesting work going on in the energy space. So we're doing an energy cap, and we're also doing desk reviews on productive use of energy and household use of energy. And we're also focusing on localization. We have a very exciting partnership digital solution called the settlement level actor mapping, which I would encourage everyone to take a look at, and I'll drop the link in the chat box. So I'll stop there and hand over to Melle van Hilte, our research colleague. Melle, over to you.
Thanks, Marika, and hello, everyone. So I'll very quickly introduce myself and introduce REACH. So my name is Melle van Hilte. I am country coordinator of Impact Initiatives in Uganda. Impact Initiatives is a Swiss INGO with the objective of promoting evidence-based decision-making in humanitarian development, protracted and recovery contexts. Our biggest initiative is REACH. And under REACH, we have various different activities that we do to try and improve evidence-based decision-making. These activities include multi-sectoral, sectoral and thematic assessments, analysis and information support to coordination structures and individual agencies, as well as remote sensing activities. The main objective of REACH is to try and make sure that affected populations receive the assistance that they need when they need it and how they need it. As Marika mentioned, Impact Initiatives is a member of ULearn. The assessment that I'll be presenting today in a little bit is done jointly by ULearn and REACH. As from our side, it was also co-funded by ECHO. I'll quickly talk to through the contents before I hand over to Geoffrey, if he's managed to join us. So very quickly, Geoffrey will be giving an introduction of the refugee context and the response in Uganda. And then I will go a bit over the methodology of the assessment, some of the key findings that we had, and then conclude with some of our key findings, as well as some reflections on the methodology and the framework that we used. And then we hope to have some time left for a Q&A. At this point, I would hand over to Geoffrey to introduce himself, the CRF, and the context. Has he managed to join us? I don't see him.
Yes, Mela, I'm here. Good evening, everybody. Yes, my name is Godfrey Young. I work for the CRF Secretariat as a livelihoods officer, and I'm happy to be here in this webinar for today. Apologies, I joined a little late because we're handling a number of things. Tomorrow we have the ministers' meeting to endorse the policy pledges for the GRF, and here running up and down. I will also, after a few minutes, I will request to be excused to continue with other duties here as well. Again, you may not be able to see my video. My computer has an issue with the webcam. I thought by today I would be able to have another computer to use for this webinar, but it hasn't been possible. Apologies, because the good manners would be for you to be able to see me as I speak. Let's move to the next. So just to give a brief again on the refugee response in Uganda, as we all know, Uganda is currently hosting over 1.5 million refugees from a number of countries. And we know that we have 13 refugee hosting districts, if you include Kampala urban. And this is spread out in 13 refugee settlements, both in the north and southwestern regions. And then the comprehensive refugee response framework, like we are all much aware, was launched in 2017, the Office of the Prime Minister. And this is the framework that is now coordinating a number of intervention, and there have been a number of response plans that have been developed under the CRF. We have 5 response plans, but for now, in this specific webinar, we want to look at one of the response plans, that's the livelihoods integrated jobs and livelihoods integrated response plan. This response plan runs from 2020 to 2025. It's a 5-year response plan and was launched in 2020. We also know within the Self-Reliance agenda, we also have the settlement transformation agenda. We had STA1 and now STA2, which was just launched this year. And this 5-year refugee response plan is very critical in a way that it facilitates the alignment of partner actions, partner interventions towards resilience and self-reliance. You'll realize that most of the discussion now is looking at resilience, building resilience and self-reliance of refugees and host communities. And there are a number of ministries that are responsible for a number of objectives and strategic interventions of the response plan. The response plan is being led by Minister of Gender, Labor and Social Development. And then we have other ministries that have specific objectives and then intervention that they deliver to Ministry of East African Affairs. We have the Ministry of Education and Sports, specifically the arm of UBTEP. We have Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries, Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives, and Ministry of Local Government. So, and then technically from the CRF Secretariat supports the response plan, its implementation and operationalization, and that's the work that I specifically do to support the Ministry of Gender. So the vision of the response plan is to ensure that we have a secure, self-reliant and resilient refugee and host community in Uganda's response. And the goal is looking at socially, economically, and financially, social, economic, and financial inclusion of refugees and host communities. And this should be done in a sustainable manner. So the goal is that by 2025, at least refugees host communities should be included socially, economically, financially in the local development. There are 5 pillars of the response plan. Pillar 1 is on promotion of social cohesion, and pillar 2 looks at entrepreneur-led development and market growth through economic and financial inclusion. Pillar 3 looks at food security, nutrition, and income security. And pillar 4 looks at access to market-relevant skills training. And the last pillar is on promotion of social protection. We will just be going briefly, but be encouraged to get into the depth of this, be able to get a document and then have a very detailed read through. For now, we're just trying to give a snapshot of what we have in that. So you'll be able to see where your interventions fall in, and we have been trying to do in the past to know the contribution of partners towards some of these pillars. We have done some mapping that we are updating, and in the short while we'll be able to really have a very comprehensive report on how a number of partners in Uganda's refugee response are contributing to each of the pillars and strategic objectives of the response plan. Next, please. So, what are the recent shifts in the response in regards to livelihoods and self-reliance? You will all realize that there have been ration cuts for refugees, the food ration cuts, and there's a prioritization exercise that was launched by WFP and OPM and share, and we now have a categorization of refugees into those ones who are more vulnerable, the ones who are moderately vulnerable, and the ones who are least like food, the one that can be called self-reliant. So now the shift is from relief to self-reliance. That's the hurdle that the response is having in relation to livelihoods, in that the funds are dwindling, resources are dwindling, and will not be able to have money to give relief assistance all the time. It's not sustainable. But how do we ensure that refugees and host communities are still able to live with dignity? So the idea now is to see how we can move refugees and host communities from relief to self-reliance. A number of interventions that are looking at building self-reliance, building resilience, so that they can live on their own, they can be able to meet essential needs on their own. And within the livelihood and resilience sector working group and the jobs and livelihoods response plan, we have already formed a reference group on self-reliance, and this group is charged with coming up with minimum indicators that the country will be using to know who is self-reliant. Because as of now, we are focusing on ensuring that we move forward to self-reliance, but there are no minimum indicators that you'll be able to know that, okay, this one is self-reliant. So there is a working group on that comprises development, humanitarian actors, including government, and it's a government-led process. And we believe by end of next month, we should be able to have some tangible outcomes out of that. So there have been partner interventions that are increasingly looking at self-reliance. WFP has come up with the self-reliance model that's looking at transitioning refugees from belief to self-reliance. There are gradation approaches by other partners, obviously pre-collab, BRAC. They have had a number of interventions using gradation approaches. UNHCR is having an increased focus on economic inclusion among refugees. And these are all aspects of building self-reliance. And that's where we are moving to now. Last, I think that should be the last slide. Okay. Alignment of humanitarian and movement activities. Just like I said, the strategic intervention, the jobs and livelihoods response plan. I indicated to you earlier that we are trying to find out how humanitarian and movement partners in the response are contributing to the jobs and livelihoods response plan, because this is an overarching response plan that all actors in the response have to contribute to, because it's having that overall vision of self-reliance, resilience, and having a secure communities that we are supporting. Measurement of self-reliance, I already talked about it, that we have the reference group in place, and we believe that they'll be able to give tangible outputs. And then coordination, the coordination of the programming on livelihoods and resilience is really something that has been taken to a higher notch, that from the national to the district level, there has been streamlining to make sure that there's some good kind of information flow to strengthen the response. And then there have been a number of research and studies that have been done by partners, and this is one of the areas that we are also looking at moving forward, that should be focused more on to generate evidence and learning on how we can push this forward, and then how we are, as actors in the refugee response, are creating a number of changes in the people that we support. And ULAN has been instrumental in this. They have done a number of studies and learnings, and they have information which you can access online. I know the ULAN will talk about some of these resources. They're really very, very interesting resources that you can get and can give information about the response, but also if you need something to inform maybe your planning, or you need to get some information around some of the things, value chains, the realities of self-reliance. So I just want to end here for now, because I know we have a tight schedule, and invite if we have any questions. But we have Malaika, would you want to take us through this, or Mela, on the question, because we would want to get your feedback. You want to get your opinions on what aspects of the Uganda refugee response and the recent shifts that resonate with your context, or a context you know, in case you know the context of Uganda, and from what I've read discussed on the shifts and the aspects of the response I think resonate with you or with your operation, please feel free to share. We are going to have a Menti poll, and then also if you're not from Uganda, maybe in your context, you can be able to share. So over to you, Malaika, to take participants to the Menti poll. Thank you, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Godfrey, for joining us. And I know you have to also leave shortly because of the work you're doing on the GRF pledges. But thank you so much for joining us. I think it's always really great to hear it from the horse's mouth, as we say. So thank you, Godfrey Aryong, the livelihoods focal point of the Uganda CRF Secretariat, to join us. So I've dropped the Mentimeter poll link into the chat box. If you could just kind of share with us your thoughts about the aspects of the refugee response in Uganda, and more importantly, the recent shifts, and those shifts are towards prioritization, to the budget cuts, a massive shift towards self-reliance focused programming, and does that resonate with your context, the context in which you work, or what you're working on from a distance? We'd be very interested to see how much we're all very, very much focused on the Uganda context, and the work that's going on there, and the transition from kind of broad support for all refugees to a prioritized model, and to a push for self-reliance programming within that nexus, kind of push for nexus work programming. And we'd like to hear from you if this is something that you see happening also in other contexts, such as maybe Kenya or South Sudan, or maybe other continents a bit further away. So please do drop your thoughts in the Mentimeter poll, and we'd be happy to get that comparative feedback. So I see people say it all resonates. I would be interested to know where this comment is coming from, if you're also where you're based, and that there's a reduction in available resources in other countries as well. Perhaps in the interest of time, Mela, you would like to move it forward, or would you prefer we give it another minute? I don't know if people are in the Mentimeter poll, and I see we're running behind a little bit. So Mela, maybe you could then take us forward, and let's do a deep dive in that research that we did a few months ago.
Yes, thanks, Marika. Let me quickly share the presentation from my side. The control freak in me likes to manage the slides myself. All right, you should be able to see the slides now. I will assume that that's the case and charge forward. So I'll start with a bit of an introduction to the methodology, spend a little bit of time on the analytical and conceptual framework that we used, and then I'll dive into our findings. So starting with the objective of our assessment that we set, which was to understand the primary barriers to sustainable livelihoods of refugees and host communities across urban and settlement contexts, to inform how livelihoods of these groups can be best supported. There's a few key definitions here that I think are important to break down. First among those is livelihoods. Intuitive as it may seem, there is still about 1 million ways to define it. We've used a definition from the Sustainable Livelihoods Guidance Sheets that were developed by DFID at the time, FCDO now, in 1999, which is to say that a livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, and activities required for a means of living. Now, a livelihood is sustainable, according to the definition, when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks, and maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets both now and in the future, while not undermining the resource base. So there are a few dimensions there, but it's essentially to say that livelihoods can be maintained or potentially enhanced even when there are shocks or environmental degradation issues. Now, a final key definition for us is on urban refugees, especially within the Ugandan context. There's various different ways in which that term is used, and it's defined differently by different actors. For our purposes, we've defined it as any individual or household that has fled from their country of origin and is now residing in an urban center. And so this is regardless of their official status, it's regardless of whether they are registered, and it's regardless of whether the urban center is a formal city or let's say a large town or something similar. Now, with all of that in mind, and we have the objective of our assessment, we then needed to figure out how we actually assess sustainable livelihoods and how we can actually understand the barriers. Now, to do this, we used this framework, which is called Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. It's come from the same paper that I mentioned earlier, and it's reflected on the slide here. It looks maybe slightly complex on when you first look at it, but it can be quite simply broken down into 5 different elements, all of which are interrelated in different ways. So first you have the vulnerability context that lies sort of at the base of this framework, and this encompasses the climate change trends, population trends, crime rates, sort of relatively stable or stagnant phenomena that characterize the environment in which households operate. Then next here are the livelihood assets, or livelihood capitals or household capitals. Terms are sort of used interchangeably here, but this has formed the main topic of our research. I'll go in a second into a little bit more details on what these livelihood assets are, but essentially they encompass all physical and non-physical assets that households have access to that they can put towards their livelihood activities, whether that's directly or indirectly. And as I mentioned, I'll go over what these assets are in just a moment. The next component of the framework are the transforming structures and processes. Essentially, these are the key actors within a given place or environment. So including the government, private sector, and public sector, third sector, and all of the different formal and informal rules that guide the way that these actors behave within that space. Next are livelihood activities, which are essentially the ways in which households are providing for either income or food for their households, or both. And then finally, what we sort of, ultimately care about, the livelihood outcomes. So household income, well-being, vulnerability, food security, and use of natural resources. So this is the framework that we used. The way that we've approached it is that we've assessed all of these 5 components separately, and then tried through all the data that we have to connect these different things and understand the way that these different components relate to each other within this Ugandan refugee context. Quickly on the assets or the household capitals that we assess. So there's 5 different ones according to this framework. First is financial capital, which is the availability of cash or the equivalent that the household has that they can put towards their livelihood activities. So this also includes things like loans. Human capital, essentially the physical ability, skills, and knowledge of household members. Natural capital, relatively straightforward, land, water, and other natural resources that households have access to. Physical capital are the infrastructures, markets, services, public spaces, shared spaces that households have access to. And then finally, social network. So their social connections, group memberships, and relationships that support their livelihood activities. Now, there's a few strengths and limitations to this framework that I want to note. In the conclusion, I'll go a bit more into sort of very practically what we learned from trying to use this framework. But regardless, there's a few things to be aware of, and a few strengths and limitations that I found to be especially important when you're applying the framework in this kind of applied research context, in this humanitarian protracted context. One of the strengths is that it's relatively easy to operationalize compared to many other livelihoods frameworks that exist. It is relatively straightforward. There's a direct path from sort of framework to how you might be able to collect data on it, and you're able to operationalize it in many different locations, essentially. It's quite transferable. It also manages to illustrate quite well the relationships between structural and household level factors, as it looks at sort of the context, the actors that are present, and then the household assets, and tries to connect these different elements. And one of the strengths that it has proven in various other contexts where the framework has been used is that it can challenge some of the assumptions that response, like livelihood responses, have been based on. And it essentially is able to do that because it covers so many bases and it doesn't assume any barriers or issues to begin with. Limitations, and I'm just highlighting a few here. First key limitation that comes out, especially in some of the more academic literature, is with regards to cultural and political capital, which are not reflected within this framework. In theory, relatively easy to add to the livelihood assets. In practice, very, very difficult to measure. It also does not take into account intra-household dynamics or inequalities. So the framework and the way that we've operationalized it looks at everything at household level. And so we don't take into account how resources and assets are distributed within the household. And another limitation, finally, is that it does sacrifice some depth and granularity for the sake of comprehensiveness and trying to cover all the bases. And so while this can tell us what is a key issue, it doesn't necessarily tell us in a lot of detail why certain things are an issue. So then just very quickly, some notes on how we actually operationalized it and what our methodology looks like. So as I mentioned, we assessed all of these 5 components separately, and we used different methods to analyze these different components. The vulnerability context and the transforming structures and processes, we primarily analyzed through secondary desk review. Now, through some of our other data collection exercises, especially qualitative and participatory exercises, we still also gather data that fit under these umbrellas. And so, of course, that was then also used to triangulate with some of these secondary data. Livelihood assets were the main part of our research, let's say. We analyzed through various methods. We used household surveys to create index scores per household per capital so that we could compare for example, financial capital, what groups and what locations had stronger capital compared to others. And we'll get to that in a second. We used in-depth interviews. We conducted them specifically with female heads of households and persons with disabilities. We had some focus group discussions with community leaders, and then finally participatory workshops with community members. And I'll speak a bit more about those later, as they ended up being a key component of our analysis. Livelihood activities were assessed through the surveys, the IDIs, and the FGDs, and outcomes we analyzed through the household surveys. So quick note on these participatory workshops. Essentially what we did is we had full day events at each location, one with refugees and one with host communities. We would have about 20 participants, 10 male participants and female participants, and we had different activities throughout the day that constituted our data collection. The activities were done in different groups and different discussions to get as unbiased responses as we could. We had different tools that we used. We used resource mapping, social mapping, seasonal calendars, and force field analysis. You might be familiar with some. They all come from the rural appraisal, participatory rural appraisal toolkit. In practice, what this looked like, I have some examples here. So this is our group of host community women in Kampala, and they are doing their resource mapping here, where they were on the map that we had printed, first prioritizing resource services that were most important to them, and then mapping those onto their area. After this was done, this would be shared with us, with our GIS and data team in Kampala, and then they would digitalize those maps, illustrate for us what were the resources that they mapped and how were those resources concentrated. Then we did these other forms of mapping, and also the seasonal calendars and the force field analysis were all then sort of digitized in Kampala, recreated online so that we wouldn't lose any of the data. In its digitized form, this is what our force field analysis looked like, which was a key part of our analysis, and a lot of where our findings came from this exercise. How it worked essentially is they had a flip chart sustainable livelihoods is at the center. And then we asked them to note down barriers on one side and enablers on the other. The different numbers you see on there is them prioritizing at the end of this, what are the most important barriers and what are the most important enablers. And this ended up being very important for us to really understand what the key barriers were from the perspective of the affected populations. Scope, I mentioned these 4 different tools that we deployed. We covered 4 settlements in Uganda, 4 secondary urban centers, and then Kampala. For the quantitative component, we had a 95% confidence level and 10% margin of error in most locations. A few exceptions are important to note, which I will quickly cover. In Gulu and Kitgum, which are both secondary urban centers in Uganda, it proved to be very hard to sample randomly, as we didn't necessarily know where refugees were. They ended up being very concentrated. And so the data on these locations is indicative rather than representative. Also means that all of the aggregated data that we're presenting is also indicative rather than representative. And unfortunately, we're not able to disaggregate for gender. That covers the methodology. I am aware of the time, so I'm trying to go through these somewhat quickly. But I'm also very curious to hear from you what you think of this framework. Do you think that this is a framework that could potentially be useful to also be used in other contexts to try and better understand livelihoods of refugees and of host communities and what kind of barriers they might face? I've listed some of the strengths and weaknesses, but I'm curious if you also have other ones that you think would be important when operationalizing this framework. So please, I will soldier on. But I would appreciate if you can, in the chat box, note some of these down. And then if we have some time, we'll go over those, and maybe we can also use them in our Q&A to discuss some of these things. All right, to the findings. As I mentioned, I'm going to go through each part of the component and how we analyze them, starting with livelihood outcomes. I won't spend too much time on this, but just highlighting these 2 main outcome level indicators that we used: the FCS, the food consumption score on one side, and the livelihood scoping strategies index, or LCSI, on the other side. 2 things that I would like to point out to you here. First being that refugees in the settlements appear to be considerably worse off than the host communities, as well as the urban refugees. They were much more likely to have borderline or poor food consumption scores, and they were also most likely to have used emergency coping strategies. The other thing I would like to point out is with regards to the urban refugees, that they surprisingly appear to be doing an outcome level very similarly to host communities in urban centers and host communities in the settlements. Then on the activities, so how are households providing for themselves? This map shows us the most commonly reported main livelihood activities of households across these groups and locations. So the way to read this is, for example, for Rhino Camp, 82% of the host community reported that crop production was their main source of income or food. This was then also reported by 65% of refugees in Rhino Camp. This sort of discrepancy that we're seeing between host communities and refugees' reliance on crop production was true across all of the settlements, where refugees were much more likely to report other livelihood activities as their main source of income and or food. In urban centers, livelihood activities tended to be even more diverse, where crop production was considerably less dominant. And you have other livelihood activities like running a restaurant, working in a restaurant or a store, or tailoring, being the most commonly reported main livelihood activity. Now, one of the main findings of our research relates to urban refugees and remittances. So when we looked at our livelihood outcomes, we looked at livelihood activities, we found that although urban refugees appear to be doing relatively well, They were also most likely to report that they were not engaging in any livelihood activities, which was reported by 17% of urban refugees. Essentially, this means that these households are not engaged in income generating activities or activities that would allow them to provide food for their households. And so then the question arises for, if that's the case, how are these urban refugees actually providing for themselves? And what we found when we analyzed their income data is that they seem to be relying very heavily on remittances and other forms of informal support from friends or family. So we found, and that's in the gray bars here, that 66% of urban refugees reported that they had received remittances in the 30 days prior to data collection. This is much, much higher than for refugees in the settlements, where 22% of households reported that they had received remittances. Another key thing to note is that among the 66% of urban refugees, the median contribution of remittances to their overall income was 55%. Essentially, what this means is that for all of these refugees in urban centers that received remittances, for the majority of them, remittances make up the majority of their income. And this is really where this reliance factor comes in. In theory, remittances or other forms of informal financial support are a positive asset, but reliance on them does illustrate and highlight some level of vulnerability. Then, again, I am aware I'm rushing through this, but please, if you have any questions, save them, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss them. On the livelihood assets and the barriers, so we have these 5 different assets that we looked at. So I mentioned we used our household survey to come up with indexed asset scores. Essentially, this means that we had 4 or 5 indicators per asset that were then calculated into one single indexed score or index for each household, for each asset, that would then allow us to compare how strong assets are and which households maybe are struggling with some of these assets. The outcome of that is this, if we use this pentagon shape that we see in the framework. I acknowledge, not the easiest to read. I'll also put this on the screen. That should be a little bit easier to read. The data is the same. Now, what this unfortunately doesn't allow us to do is to say, well, for a host community in urban centers, financial capital is stronger than human capital. That, unfortunately, we cannot say, because the way that the indexes are built is not objective or standardized. There's no sort of standard way of calculating these scores to have them be comparable. So we cannot do that. However, what we can do is compare within a certain capital. So if we look at financial capital, we can say that host communities in urban centers appear to have much stronger financial capital than refugees in those same urban centers. And as well as, the refugees in the settlements. And this is true for many of the capitals. So for financial capital, human capital, and physical capital, the host community in urban centers have the best access to these capitals. For natural capital and for social capitals, the host communities in the settlements who have best access to these things. Refugees in urban centers and refugees in the settlements tend to have considerably less access to some of these capitals. So what now we are still missing is being able to prioritize them and say which of these capitals and what assets within these capitals are where households are struggling the most, and what are the enablers and barriers really of sustainable livelihoods. And this is where all of our other data collection came in, and especially the participatory data collection, to say something about this. The 3 main barriers that we found. First one falls under financial capital and relates to access to formal financial services. Essentially, we found that refugees often have access to informal forms of credit through savings groups, to local businesses, to friends and family. but that these forms of financial services often don't allow households to obtain loans that are large enough to invest into their livelihoods. Access to formal financial services that would be able to access loans of the needed sizes is often very difficult, either through physical or social barriers, depending on whether refugees are residing in settlements or urban centers. Second key barrier that we identified relates to land. Refugees often have poor access to land, meaning that the plots that they are assigned are not always large enough. Sometimes there's issues with the quality of the land. And if they are accessing land beyond what they're assigned, there's issues around secure lease and renting arrangements with the host community. And then finally, we have access to markets as another key issue. In the settlements, there's considerable physical barriers to accessing markets. There's limited infrastructure, limited public transport, which prevents households from accessing markets. And this is true for both host communities and refugees. In urban centers, the barriers to markets are much more social and relates primarily to discrimination and documentation issues. I have more slides on these. I will skip through them for the sake of time, but I believe the slides will be shared after, and so please do have a look if you'd like to understand a bit better these barriers. I will very quickly talk about the some of the cross-cutting issues. We have these two components of the research that we primarily assess through secondary desk review. And obviously there's an endless amount of different contextual factors that are important, but there's 4 in particular that I will just quickly highlight that are important in the Ugandan refugee context. First is the reliance on social networks. And this is specific to refugees. We found they very often have to rely on their social networks to access services, markets, employment, or land. The kinds of networks that are important differ between urban refugees and refugees in settlements. So urban refugees tend to rely very, very heavily on their networks with other refugees in that urban center. And that's who they rely on to access customers for their businesses and services. Whereas for refugees in the settlements, it's their relationships with the host community that are really important for them to be able to access land, especially. Second area I want to highlight is with regards to documentation issues. Documentation can be an issue for many refugees when they want to access employment or services. Now, documentation issues are quite complex, as it's not always clear if the lack of documentation is the issue or if it's more so about a lack of awareness about the kinds of documentation that are actually required for certain services as well as employment. Third area to highlight is on the prolonged pressure on natural resources. And when refugees arrive in Uganda and they register in the settlements, they are assigned a plot of land. However, with the sort of increasing populations, that also puts increasing pressures on the availability of land around the settlements and in Uganda more generally. There's also use of resources like water and firewood that can put pressure on natural resources in the long term. Finally, there is generally an underdeveloped private sector in Uganda, and especially in refugee hosting districts. The private sector tends to be dominated by informal sole proprietor businesses that are not able to hire staff. And so even if refugees wanted to work under some kind of wage employment arrangement, that might not actually be something that is available in the settlements or around the settlements. So we have another Menti, so I can take a sip of water before I go to my conclusion. So now that we've presented a bit some of these barriers that we're facing in Uganda when it comes to sustainable livelihoods, I know we have a good amount of participants that are based elsewhere. And so we'd like to know if there's other barriers that are also important in other contexts, or if it largely overlaps and if you see these same barriers across different refugee hosting contexts. And even for the participants that are in Uganda, do these also align with what you're seeing, and or is there anything key that we are missing? You should be able to use the same link that was shared last time to enter your responses. We will give it a few minutes before I go into my concluding remarks, or my conclusion, and then we'll hand it over for the actual concluding remarks. I'm wondering if people are not entering the Menti or if my screen is frozen. Both are possible.
I think, Mela, you need maybe to refresh the Menti on your presentation. Otherwise, I can share it from my end. I see the responses coming, so let me know. I can share it.
Maybe I just finished. I have 2 more slides left, and then I hand the sharing back over to you to go over the poll. Does that work? And then people can keep entering their answers.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So while you continue to put some answers in there, I'll just wrap up on my end, if it lets me. Uh-oh. All right, there we are. So in terms of our assessment findings, key things that we found is refugees in the settlements appear to be the worst off among all the groups that we assessed. Crop production dominates as a livelihood activity in most locations, though refugees do seem to be less likely to be relying on crop production in the host community. Refugees in urban centers appear to rely heavily on remittances to be able to provide for their households' needs. And the key barriers that we found to sustainable livelihoods were limited access to formal financial services, land, and markets. Then a few reflections on the framework and the methodology. So generally, I found it to be a very useful framework to structure data collection and analysis. For these kinds of comprehensive livelihoods assessment, there's about 1 million different questions you can ask, 1 million different types of data you can collect. And so it is important to be able to somehow draw a circle around it. And then also, once you get all of your data, to then structure how you're analyzing it. And so in that respect, the framework was incredibly useful. And overall, I would say that it's something that could also be very relevant to use and relatively practical in other contexts. Now, despite having said all that, you do have to acknowledge that it does lack some detail on specific issues. We've been able to find that access to formal financial services is a key issue. We know some of the reasons why that's the case, but we lack some of the really in-depth knowledge on now what those issues are. Although luckily there's other assessments that do go more in-depth into these things. Another key thing with regards to the framework, what we found is that both quantitative and participatory data ended up playing a massive and very important role in this assessment. The participatory data was used to be able to actually rank between different capitals and between different assets what are the key ones that households need to have access to be able to build sustainable livelihoods, where the quantitative data that allowed us to compare between different groups who was most affected by these issues. And then finally, more on the methodology side, I don't know how many of the researchers in the call, but the other thing that we found is with the participatory data collection, that recording and documentation of data is very complex, very important, and requires a lot of planning and a lot of testing to make sure that the data you're going to get back can be used for analysis. Now that was it from me. I'll stop sharing, and then Julie, if you can show some of the poll results, I can quickly talk those through. And then I think, unfortunately, the Q&A is not in the cards. But then I will hand it over after the poll to Carrie. All right. Access to weight and person access to documents. yeah, both of these are things that came out not in our analysis of the assets, but much more broadly. Right. Okay. I think rather than maybe spending some more time on this, I personally have time for a Q&A. But I'm not sure what we want to do.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I think, this has been a really informative session, and I know I speak for all of us to say we're really walking away from this with a really much deeper understanding of the Ugandan context. Because this is going to be recorded, we do have probably 5 extra minutes for a Q&A for those that are able to stick around. So I would invite those who are able to have questions to stick on, and for those that need to hop off the webinar at the top of the hour, that's also fine, and we'll share the recording so that you can see any responses. So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of the webinar screen. And we will start to go through those. But let me just kick us off. I'm really interested in understanding sort of what surprised you about the study. Are there any things that came out that was not expected that you would be interested to share with the group?
So from my perspective, the thing that I found really surprising was on the urban refugees. So generally, urban refugees about Uganda, very little is known. And that was a big sort of reason for us wanting to include them in this study, partly with the assumption that maybe refugees in urban centers had more livelihood opportunities, and maybe we could learn from some of the things they were doing to inform how those that are in the settlements could be assisted. But then what was really surprising is that, yes, they appear to be doing better, but they appear to be doing better because they have access to these forms of financial support that the refugees in the settlements just don't have. And so it made us also look at these two as very different types of population groups, as refugees in urban centers just having different resources, considerably different resources that allow them to live in those urban centers. But despite that, they're still not necessarily able to build their livelihoods, but they have to keep relying on those sources of income. And that to me was something that I hadn't expected, and that wasn't one of our research questions, and we weren't really looking for it, but was very interesting to find and taught us a lot about that group.
Wonderful, thank you. I have 2 more questions, and if others have them, please, do put them in the chat. But my other question is, and it's too bad that Godfrey's had to hop off, because I'm interested in understanding what types of formats of evidence have been the most useful for sharing out with policymakers. I know that's a big question for our network, making sure that the evidence and research is really digestible. So do you have any reflections on that as you've also been trying to link your evidence to policy solutions?
To me, this is very much a question for Marijke. I don't know if you're in a position to take it.
Yes, sorry. I was, my children were making a lot of noise just now. Can you please repeat the question for me, Carrie?
Absolutely. Because we have our network is really focused on also translating some of the evidence and research into sort of policy solutions or digestible formats for policymakers. I'm just interested if you have any best practices or lessons learned from this exercise that you could share that would be useful for people working on this type of work in other contexts.
Yes, that is exactly the mandate of the Learning Hub, so it's a great question for us. I think one of the standard things that we do is make sure that we have it in a variety of formats. So a webinar like this one, we're hoping to do a blog and a podcast soon. We have a 2-pager, you know, but other than that, those are obviously outputs that make it more digestible, more summarized, making sure the report itself is accessible. You'll see it has a lot of kind of links, graphs, images, visuals. And then in addition, now maybe we're responding directly to your policy angle question. What we do is we engage with a lot of the policymakers across the refugee response. Obviously, this year was very special because of the Global Refugee Forum that's coming up at the end of December. And in Uganda, there was, as I mentioned, there is this, or as Godfrey mentioned rather, there is real push for self-reliance programming. So there was a big spotlight on livelihoods and self-reliance in the run-up to the Global Refugee Forum. So we were able to support the organization of a roundtable in preparation for that, which was led by the different line ministries, Ministry of Gender, JLIRP, and OPM and the CRF. And so obviously then we were able to take all of that evidence and kind of break it apart and put it back together so that it feeds into these different working groups that we're preparing for that roundtable. And what we're working on now is to kind of now look at, you know, what policy recommendations are coming up across this research, but also other pieces of work that we have been doing. And I can drop a couple of links in the chat box on agricultural value chains, on entrepreneurship, all of these different things that feed into that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but it's also about, I would say, maintaining a close network of key responders as well as policymakers and making sure that there's, you know, bilateral and direct conversations with them and feeding bits and pieces in where it's most relevant.
Great, thank you so much, Marika. And in the interest of time, I think we'll close here. But again, I want to thank all of our panelists and researchers for really sharing out this exciting work. And it seems very relevant, not only for Uganda, but also for other contexts. And so it's great to learn more about the tool that you utilized as well, because I think we'll have a lot of interest from others on this call and, you know, exploring use of that in their own work contexts. Before we conclude, I also want to extend an invitation to all of you to join the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative's Community of Practice. This is a network of professionals that engage in supporting refugee self-reliance through programming, research, and policy engagement. We meet bi-monthly for calls where we share updates from the broader community. And then we sponsor a number of webinars and events like this, and also have a number of working groups that focus on specific topics like research or market systems development in refugee contexts. So you can sign up for our community of practice using the link that's shared in the chat, or by going to our website, refugeeselfreliance.org/COP. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time.